What if there are places on Earth you're simply not allowed to see, not because they're dangerous, not because they're inaccessible, but because someone decided they should remain hidden? Across the world, there are locations so restricted that even getting close could get you detained, fined, or worse. Places that don't appear on tourist maps. Places where cameras are forbidden. Places where even locals are told to stay away. Some of them are protected for cultural reasons. Some are sealed off for safety. And others, well, no one really gives a clear explanation. So the real question is, what exactly are they hiding? And why are these places, especially in one of the most mysterious regions on Earth, so tightly controlled? In this video, we're going to explore a series of locations in Tibet that are officially off-limits. Places that are rarely talked about, and in some cases, never fully explained. Tibet has always carried an unusual kind of weight. It's not just the altitude or the isolation. There's something about it that feels older than the rest of the world. For centuries, Tibet has been associated with spirituality, hidden knowledge, and traditions that outsiders often struggle to understand. Monasteries perched on cliffs, rituals passed down in silence, and landscapes so vast and empty, they almost feel unreal. But beyond the beauty and the mysticism, there's another layer. A layer that most visitors never get to see, because certain places in Tibet are not just difficult to reach, they are deliberately closed off. Now, to be clear, restricted areas exist in many countries. Military zones, sacred sites, protected ecosystems. That's not unusual, but Tibet is different. Here, the restrictions feel deeper, more intentional. Sometimes, entire regions require special permits just to enter. Other areas are completely sealed, with no official reason given. And what makes it even more intriguing is this. In many cases, the explanations don't quite match the level of restriction. You're told it's for preservation, or safety, or religious protection, but then you start noticing things. Stories that don't fully align, details that are left out, questions that don't get answered. And that's where curiosity begins to grow. I remember the first time I started reading about these places. At first, it seemed straightforward. A remote region protecting its culture, trying to avoid over-tourism, preserving something fragile. And honestly, that made sense. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized something felt off. Not in a dramatic conspiracy theory kind of way, just incomplete. Like you were only seeing part of the picture. Take the idea of forbidden places. On the surface, it sounds simple, a place you're not allowed to go. But in Tibet, that idea carries a different kind of meaning. Because these places aren't just closed, they're often surrounded by silence. Not much information, very few photos, and sometimes almost no official documentation at all. In a world where nearly everything is mapped, photographed, and shared online, that kind of absence stands out. And maybe there's a reasonable explanation for all of it. Maybe these places really are too sacred, too fragile, or too dangerous to open up. But at the same time, there's always that small voice asking, if that's the case, why not explain it more clearly? Why keep things so vague? Why does it feel like certain details are being held back? I'm not saying there's something hidden in a dramatic sense, but I do think there's something not fully understood. And sometimes, that's even more interesting, because it leaves space for questions, and questions are where real exploration begins. So in this video, we're not jumping to conclusions. We're not claiming there's some secret waiting to be uncovered. Instead, we're going to look at what is known, what is officially said, and what doesn't quite add up. We'll go through specific locations, places in Tibet that are restricted or completely off limits, and for each one, we'll try to understand. What is the official reason? What do people say about it? And why does it feel like there might be more to the story? Some of these places are tied to ancient traditions. Others are linked to geography so extreme that access becomes nearly impossible, and a few are restricted in ways that are harder to explain. As we move through each location, I want you to keep something in mind. Not everything unknown is mysterious, but not everything is fully explained either. And sometimes, the truth sits somewhere in between. So let's begin. Not with assumptions, not with theories, but with the places themselves. There is one place in Tibet that quietly stands apart from everything else. Not because it is the highest, and not because it is the hardest to reach, but because no one is allowed to climb it. Mount Kailash rises to just over 6,600 meters, which in a region like the Himalayas doesn't sound particularly extreme. There are mountains far taller, far more dangerous. And yet they have all been climbed, studied, documented, and turned into milestones of human achievement. Kailash hasn't, not once in any confirmed modern sense. At first, the explanation seems straightforward. The mountain is sacred, not just within a single belief system, but across several. In Hinduism, it is believed to be the home of Shiva. In Buddhism, it represents the center of the universe. In Jainism and Bon traditions, it carries its own deep and layered meaning. Climbing it is not just discouraged, it is considered a violation, something that disrupts the balance of what the mountain represents, rather than simply reaching its peak. That alone would be enough to justify keeping people away. But what makes it linger in your mind is how absolute that restriction is. There are no exceptions, no controlled expeditions, no limited scientific access that allows for study while maintaining respect. The idea of climbing Kailash is not negotiated or adjusted. It is simply closed, and over time, there have been moments where that boundary seemed like it might shift, where experienced climbers showed interest, where discussions briefly surfaced about possible attempts. But each time, the same thing happened. The plans disappeared, permissions were withdrawn. The conversation ended without much explanation, as if the possibility itself wasn't meant to be entertained for long. And then there are the stories that surround the mountain, the kind that are difficult to verify but continue to circulate. People talk about unusual conditions near Kailash, about sudden shifts in weather that don't match surrounding areas, about a sense of disorientation when getting too close. Some go further, describing strange ideas about time behaving differently, about the body reacting in ways that feel accelerated or distorted. On the surface, these claims sound exaggerated, even unrealistic, and it's easy to dismiss them. But they don't disappear. They persist, not necessarily because they are true, but because there is no direct way to confirm or deny them. When a place remains completely inaccessible, speculation fills the space that information would normally occupy. Personally, it doesn't feel necessary to take those stories literally to understand why Kailash stands out. The more grounded explanation is already enough. It is one of the few places where belief has drawn a clear line that human ambition has chosen not to cross. Instead of climbing it, people walk around it, a journey that stretches for over 50 kilometers, sometimes completed in a single day, sometimes over weeks, and in the most devoted cases, done through full-body prostration, step by step, movement by movement. That choice says something. It shifts the focus away from conquering the mountain and toward experiencing it differently, in a way that aligns with what it represents, rather than what it offers physically. And when you look at it that way, Kailash becomes less about mystery and more about restraint, not the kind forced by difficulty, but the kind chosen out of respect, even if that respect is not fully understood by everyone outside of it. Still, in a world where nearly every peak has been reached, the fact that one remains untouched continues to stand out, quietly raising the question of whether some boundaries exist for reasons that go beyond capability. A similar feeling appears again when you look at the Tsangpo Gorge, although in a completely different form. This is not a place defined by belief or symbolism, but by scale and environment. The Yarlung Tsangpo River moves across Tibet in a way that feels almost ordinary at first, until it reaches the section where everything changes. The land drops, the terrain tightens, and the river cuts through one of the deepest canyons on Earth, often described as even more extreme than the Grand Canyon. Here, the restriction is easier to explain on the surface. The conditions are dangerous. The cliffs are unstable, the weather unpredictable, and the river itself powerful enough to make navigation extremely difficult. Even experienced expeditions have struggled in this environment, and some have failed to complete their routes. So when access is limited, when permits are required and often denied, it makes sense to assume it's a matter of safety. But what makes the Tsangpo Gorge feel different is not just the difficulty, it's the incompleteness. Despite modern technology, despite satellites and mapping systems that have covered most of the planet in detail, parts of this region remain only partially understood, not entirely unknown, but not fully mapped in the way we've come to expect. There are still sections where information feels fragmented, where exploration has reached its limits, not because people haven't tried, but because the environment doesn't easily allow it. And that creates a different kind of curiosity. Not the kind driven by the idea that something is being hidden, but the kind that comes from encountering something that doesn't fully yield to observation. Some researchers argue that the restrictions are entirely practical, that the risks outweigh the benefits, and that the lack of complete data is simply a reflection of how extreme the region is. That explanation holds, and probably explains most of it. But at the same time, it leaves a small gap. A sense that even now, with everything we have, there are still places that resist being fully understood. Not because they are protected in a cultural or political sense, but because they exist in conditions that don't easily align with how we explore and document the world. And maybe that's what connects Kailash and the Tsangpo Gorge, even though they are completely different in nature. One is defined by belief, the other by geography, but both exist slightly outside the usual pattern. They are not entirely closed, but not fully open either. They allow presence, but not complete access. And in that space between what is available and what remains out of reach, something else begins to form. Not a clear mystery, not a hidden truth, but a quiet reminder that even now, there are limits to what we can approach, understand, or fully explain. At first, not every restricted place in Tibet feels forbidden. Some of them are right there in front of you, visible, documented, even famous. You can walk through parts of them, take photos, listen to guides explain what you're seeing. Everything gives the impression that nothing is being hidden. But if you stay with it a little longer, if you pay attention to where access quietly stops, you begin to notice something subtle. You're only being shown part of the picture. The Patala Palace is probably the clearest example of that. It dominates the skyline of Lhasa in a way that feels almost unreal, like it wasn't built as much as it emerged from the landscape. When you walk through it, you move across rooms filled with history, layers of meaning stacked on top of each other, each hallway leading into something older, something quieter. And yet at certain points, the path simply ends. Not dramatically, not with warnings or barriers that feel aggressive, just closed. Areas that are preserved, but never fully opened. Rooms that once belonged to the Dalai Lamas, inner chambers that are still maintained but remain out of reach. On the surface, the explanation makes sense. The structure is ancient, fragile, and deeply significant. Limiting access protects it. That's reasonable. But what makes it linger in your mind is not the restriction itself, it's the absence of detail around it. Even among researchers and historians, information about these inner sections is limited, not entirely missing, but incomplete. There are no widely available records that fully describe what exists in those spaces, no clear visual documentation. Just a quiet understanding that some parts are not meant to be seen in the same way as the rest. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that what's being protected might not be something physical in the way we usually imagine. It may not be about objects or hidden artifacts. It might be about context, about meaning that doesn't translate easily outside of the culture it belongs to. There are things that lose their significance when they are simply displayed. Things that only exist properly within a certain environment, a certain belief system. In that sense, what is hidden is not necessarily secret, but protected from being misunderstood. That idea becomes even clearer when you shift away from architecture and look at something entirely different, like the Changtang region in northern Tibet. There are no palaces there, no visible structures carrying centuries of history, just vast open land, stretching further than you can realistically process. Endless plains, frozen lakes, and a level of altitude that already makes survival difficult. At first, it seems like the kind of place no one would even think to restrict, simply because it feels so empty. But that emptiness is exactly the point. Changtang is one of the largest protected areas in the world, and access to it is controlled far more strictly than most people would expect. Not just for tourists, but even for researchers. There are zones that require special permits, areas where entry is simply not granted, sections that remain untouched in a very literal sense. Officially, it's about conservation. The ecosystem is fragile. The wildlife depends on isolation, and human presence could disrupt patterns that have existed for generations. And again, that explanation holds, probably more strongly than in most cases. But when you look at the scale of the restriction, it raises a different kind of thought. Not suspicion, not in the sense of something being hidden, but awareness of how little control we actually have over places like this. Because Changtang isn't just remote, it operates on a level where human systems don't easily apply. There are no clear boundaries in the way we're used to thinking about them. No infrastructure, no consistent observation, no ongoing interaction that defines it in familiar terms. And in a world where almost everything is mapped, recorded, and constantly updated, that kind of absence stands out. Not because it suggests something unusual is there, but because it reminds you that there are still places where we are not the dominant presence. Places where nature doesn't adjust itself around us, but continues independently, almost indifferent to whether we understand it or not. When you step back and look at these locations together, something starts to take shape. The restrictions are not all the same, but they share a certain pattern. Some places are closed because they are sacred, others because they are fragile, and some simply because they exist in conditions that resist easy access. But what they all have in common is that they are not fully integrated into the way we usually interact with the world. They sit slightly outside of it, and maybe that's what makes them feel mysterious. Not because they are hiding something dramatic or unknown, but because they don't fit neatly into the frameworks we rely on to understand things. We're used to having explanations that are complete, visible, and easy to verify. We expect access to lead to understanding. But in these cases, access is limited, and understanding remains partial. There's always a small gap, and that gap is where curiosity lives. I don't think these places are concealing secrets in the way people often imagine. There's no clear evidence pointing to anything like that. But I do think they reveal something important about the limits of perspective, about how not everything needs to be fully exposed to exist meaningfully. Some things are preserved, not because they are hiding the truth, but because they belong to a context that doesn't translate when removed from it. And in a strange way, that might be more interesting than any hidden story, because it suggests that there are still parts of the world that are not entirely shaped around being seen, explained, or consumed. Places that remain, quietly, on their own terms. And maybe that's the real reason they feel forbidden. Not because we are being kept away from them, but because they were never meant to be approached in the way we're used to approaching everything else. By the time you step back and take in all of these places together, something begins to shift in the way you see them. At the beginning, it's almost instinctive to assume that anything restricted must be hiding something, that anything you're not allowed to access must contain answers that are being kept out of reach. It feels natural to connect the idea of forbidden with the idea of secret, but the longer you sit with it, the more that assumption starts to lose its weight, not because the curiosity disappears, but because it no longer feels like the right question. What slowly emerges instead is something quieter and more grounded. These places are not all restricted for the same reason, but they share a common thread. Some are protected because they are sacred, and opening them would strip away the meaning they carry. Some are limited because they are fragile, and even small changes could permanently alter what has existed there for generations. Others are simply so remote, so extreme, or so disconnected from human systems that access itself becomes impractical, even unnecessary. When you begin to see it this way, the idea of something being forbidden starts to change. It no longer feels like being kept away from something hidden, but more like encountering a boundary that was never meant to be crossed in the first place. That shift is subtle, but it matters, because we are used to a world where access is expected. If something exists, we assume we should be able to see it, document it, understand it fully. We've built systems around that expectation. Maps, data, images, constant updates. Everything becomes available, eventually. So when something doesn't follow that pattern, when a place remains partially closed or only loosely explained, it creates a kind of tension. Not necessarily because something is wrong, but because it interrupts what we've come to expect. And that's where the curiosity deepens, but also where it becomes more complicated. Because sometimes the absence of a complete explanation doesn't point to something hidden. Sometimes it simply marks the edge of what we are able, or even meant, to fully understand. There are places that don't translate easily into the frameworks we rely on. Cultural spaces that lose their meaning when removed from their context. Natural environments that don't respond well to observation or interference. Locations where the act of fully revealing them would in some way diminish what makes them significant. When you think about Mount Kailash, untouched despite decades of technological and physical advancement, it doesn't feel like a limitation of ability. It feels like a deliberate choice, one that reflects something deeper than exploration. When you consider the inner sections of the Potala Palace, still closed despite global interest, it doesn't come across as secrecy in the usual sense, but more like a boundary around something that isn't meant to be reduced into display. And when you picture the vast, nearly empty stretches of Changtang, or the difficult, incomplete mapping of the Tangpo Gorge, it becomes clear that some places don't just resist access, they exist outside of the patterns we use to define access altogether. None of this points to a hidden answer waiting to be uncovered, but it does point to something else, something that's easy to overlook. The idea that there are still parts of the world that are not fully shaped around us, not designed for our understanding, not structured to fit into the way we interpret things. And maybe that's why they stay with you longer than places you can easily visit. Because they don't resolve themselves. They don't close the loop. They leave something open, something unfinished. That unfinished feeling can be uncomfortable at first, especially when you're used to everything having a clear explanation. But over time, it starts to feel less like something missing and more like something preserved. A reminder that not everything needs to be fully exposed to be meaningful. That some value comes precisely from the fact that it remains partially out of reach. So the question slowly changes. It moves away from what is being hidden and turns into something quieter, something less about uncovering and more about understanding limits. Are we always meant to know everything about the places we encounter? And if the answer is no, then what does it mean to stand at the edge of something and accept that it remains just beyond our reach? That's where curiosity becomes something different. Not a drive to break through every boundary, but an awareness of why those boundaries exist in the first place. And in a way, that awareness might be the closest thing we get to understanding places like these. Not by entering them, not by fully explaining them, but by recognizing that their distance is part of what defines them. And maybe that's what makes them feel so powerful. Not because they are hiding something from us, but because they remind us that the world is still larger than what we can access, larger than what we can fully understand. And that sometimes, the most meaningful things are the ones that remain just out of reach.